January 1989, Tokyo, Japan. The Imperial Palace sits on 3.4 square kilometers of land in the heart of the city. Manicured gardens, ancient stone walls, a moat that has stood for 4 centuries, and according to the property valuations of that moment, that single plot of land is worth more than every piece of real estate in the entire state of California. Not some of California, all of it. Every office tower in Los Angeles, every vineyard in Napa, every beachfront home in Malibu, every warehouse, every strip mall, every suburban house from San Diego to Sacramento, all of it combined is worth less than the garden where the Emperor of Japan takes his morning walks. And Tokyo is not the only city doing this. The land under the Ginza shopping district, a neighborhood about the size of a mid-sized American airport, is valued at more than the entire landmass of Canada. Japan is a country smaller than California, and on paper it is worth more than the United States of America. How does that happen? How does a nation convince itself, and for a while convince the rest of the world, that its land is worth 5 times what any rational calculation could justify? And why does the psychology that drove Japan to that cliff edge in 1989 look so unnervingly familiar when you look at the global economy today? This is the story of the Japanese asset price bubble. By the end you will understand the mechanism that inflated the most expensive real estate in human history. See the 7-step pattern that has repeated in every bubble since the tulip mania of 1637 and recognize exactly what the warning signs look like before the music stops. This is not just history, this is a warning dressed in a business suit. But to understand how Japan got there you have to go back. Way back. It is the spring of 1955. Tokyo is rebuilding. The city that American firebombing reduced to ash a decade earlier is alive again with construction noise and the smell of fresh concrete and the particular energy of a people who have decided collectively and with extraordinary discipline that they will not simply recover, they will become dominant. The streets are crowded with workers in hard hats. Department stores are opening their doors for the first time. Factories that were making military equipment in 1944 are now making transistor radios and precision cameras and components for American appliances. Japan has discovered something that will define the next 4 decades of its national life. The discovery is this: you do not need natural resources to become rich. You need organization, you need education, you need a government willing to pick industries and back them with everything it has, and you need a population that saves. Japan has all 4. The Japanese savings rate in the post-war decades is extraordinary by any international standard. While American households spend freely and borrow against the future, Japanese households save between 15 and 25% of their income as a matter of cultural habit, almost moral obligation. That savings flows into the banking system. The banking system, guided and directed by the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, channels those funds into the industries that government has identified as strategically important: steel, shipbuilding, automobiles, electronics. The system works with a precision that Western economists watch with a mixture of admiration and alarm. By 1968, Japan has the 2nd largest economy in the world. By the 1980s, it is threatening the first. Japanese companies are buying American companies, American office buildings, American golf courses. Sony buys Columbia Pictures. Mitsubishi Estate buys Rockefeller Center. Japanese tourists photograph themselves in front of American landmarks as new owners of those landmarks. The Japanese economic miracle is not a metaphor. It is a documented, measured, extraordinary fact. And in this world, land is the foundation of everything. Japanese banks lend against collateral, and collateral means land. Land values in Japan have been rising steadily since the 1950s. So steadily and so reliably that the Japanese have developed a phrase for it, essentially meaning that land prices only ever go up. This is not propaganda. For 30 years it has been true. A piece of land bought in Tokyo in 1955 is worth 10 times more in 1970. A piece bought in 1970 is worth 10 times more in 1985. The compounding is real, the track record is undeniable, and every bank in Japan has built its entire lending model on the assumption that this will continue. Borrow against land. Land goes up. Borrow more against the higher land value. Land goes up again. The system feeds itself in a loop that feels, and for a long time genuinely is, a perpetual wealth creation machine. Meet Hiroshi Tanaka. He is a 44-year-old salaryman at a mid-sized manufacturing company in Osaka. He joined the company at 22, as his father had joined his company at 22, and he expects to retire from it at 60. He has never speculated in his life. He is not a gambler. He is a careful man who packs his own lunch and takes the same train route every morning and has a savings account he has contributed to every month for 22 years without missing a single deposit. In 1985, he buys a small house in the suburbs of Osaka for 40 million yen, stretching his finances to the limit and taking out a 25-year mortgage. His bank tells him he has made a brilliant investment. His colleagues tell him he has made a brilliant investment. Everyone around him is buying property, and everyone around them is buying property, and the prices are going up and up and up, and Hiroshi feels, for the first time in his careful, disciplined life, that he has caught a wave. But Keiko Yamamoto, a 38-year-old economist at the Bank of Japan, sees something else entirely. She has been running the numbers on land valuations against rental yields, against corporate earnings, against any rational fundamental measure of what land should be worth given what it produces. The numbers she is finding are not just elevated. They are detached from reality in a way that she finds deeply unsettling. She writes memos. She raises the issue in meetings. Her colleagues listen politely and return to their calculations. The Ministry of Finance has a phrase for people like Keiko. They call them Cassandras. The word does not need translation. And then there is Yamaguchi-san. He runs a small real estate brokerage in Ginza, Tokyo, and he knows that most of what he is selling is fantasy. He knows the prices are disconnected from any income the properties could generate. He knows that the people buying these properties are not buying them to live in or rent out at a profit. They are buying them to sell to someone else at a higher price, which is the definition of speculation, not investment. He knows this. He sells anyway. Because the commissions are extraordinary, because the money is flowing faster than he has ever seen money flow, and because the one thing more certain than the bubble eventually popping is that it has not popped yet and probably will not pop before his next commission check. What none of them know yet is that a meeting in New York in 1985 has already set the fuse burning. September 22, 1985. The Plaza Hotel, New York City. The finance ministers of the 5 largest economies in the world sit down to solve a problem that is, at its core, America's problem. The US dollar is too strong. American exports are too expensive. American manufacturers are losing market share to Japan and Germany, and they are furious about it. The solution the ministers agree to, the Plaza Accord, is elegant in its simplicity and catastrophic in its consequences for Japan. The major economies will intervene in currency markets to weaken the dollar and strengthen the yen. Japan agrees. Japan has no real choice. The trade relationship with America is the foundation of the entire Japanese export model. And if America decides to protect its industries through tariffs instead, the consequences for Japan would be worse. So Japan agrees, and the yen strengthens dramatically, and the Japanese export machine begins to slow, and the Bank of Japan faces a choice it will get catastrophically wrong. To offset the damage to exporters from the strong yen, the Bank of Japan slashes interest rates. Between 1985 and 1987, the official discount rate falls to 2.5%, the lowest it has been in the post-war era. Cheap money floods the system. Banks already sitting on enormous profits from decades of rising land values start lending with an aggression that would have seemed reckless 5 years earlier. But it does not feel reckless. It feels like opportunity. Because when interest rates are 2.5% and land prices are rising at 15% a year, borrowing money to buy land is not just rational. It is, mathematically, free money. You borrow at 2.5%, your asset appreciates at 15%. You pocket the 12.5% difference and borrow again against the higher value. Every cycle generates more collateral, which generates more loans, which generates more buying, which generates higher prices, which generates more collateral. The loop runs faster and faster, and the entire Japanese financial system, from the largest city bank to the smallest regional credit union, is inside this loop. The acceleration is about to go vertical. 1986. Something shifts in the air of Tokyo. The polite, disciplined, save-for-the-future culture that built the Japanese miracle is still visible on the surface, but underneath it something rawer has been released. It starts with the corporations. Japanese companies, sitting on enormous unrealized gains from their land holdings, discover that they can make more money from financial speculation in a single quarter than from manufacturing operations in an entire year. The Japanese have a word for this, zeitek, which translates roughly as financial engineering. The practice of companies using their balance sheets as speculative instruments rather than operational assets. Toyota and Nissan and Sony are making enormous profits, but they are making more of those profits from stock and land speculation than from selling cars and electronics. The manufacturing genius that built Japan is still there. but it is being quietly crowded out by something less patient and far more dangerous. The banks are now lending against almost anything with the word Japan attached to it. A golf club membership in Tokyo, a piece of paper entitling the holder to play a round of golf, trades at the same price as a suburban apartment in Munich. There are golf club memberships trading for more than 300 million yen, which at the exchange rates of the time means a single round of golf on a Saturday has the same entry cost as a luxury house in London. Corporations are buying golf clubs and mountain resorts in Pacific Islands not because they intend to use them but because every asset, with the Japanese premium attached, is going up, and the loan to buy it costs almost nothing. Ordinary salary workers are taking second mortgages on their homes to buy stocks. Taxi drivers are giving stock tips between fares. Office ladies, as the newspapers call them, the female clerical workers in Tokyo's financial district, are trading securities on their lunch breaks and outperforming the professionals. The Nikkei stock index, which stood at roughly 10,000 points in 1984, the real estate numbers are even harder to process. Between 1985 and 1991, commercial land prices in the 6 major Japanese cities increased by 300%. Residential land prices increased by 180%. The total value of all land in Japan reaches a peak of approximately 2,000 trillion yen, roughly 4 times the value of all land in the United States, a country that is 25 times larger by area. There are apartment buildings in central Tokyo that are appraised at values that would never be recouped through rent in 200 years of continuous occupancy. The math does not work, but the math, at this point, has been suspended. Everyone knows it is expensive. Everyone says the market will correct eventually, and everyone buys anyway because the one thing that feels more dangerous than being in the bubble is being the person who stood outside it while everyone else got rich. Hiroshi Tanaka, the careful salaryman from Osaka, has refinanced his house twice since 1985. His original 40 million yen property is now valued at 120 million yen. The bank calls him personally to offer him more credit. His colleagues at work are all doing the same thing. One of them has quit his job to trade stocks full-time. 2 others have formed a small investment club that meets on Thursday evenings to pool capital for speculative land purchases in the outer prefectures. Hiroshi does not quit his job. He is too careful for that. But he does borrow an additional 30 million yen against his home equity and put it into equities and a small commercial property in suburban Kyoto. His bank approves the loan in 4 days. He has never felt more financially secure in his life. This is the top. Nobody knows it yet. Then one morning in early January 1990, something small happens. The Japanese Ministry of Finance, watching land prices with growing alarm, introduces new regulations requiring banks to limit the growth of their real estate lending. The announcement is technical. It is buried in regulatory language. Most newspaper readers do not notice it. Most traders do not notice it. But the banks notice it. And the banks begin, very quietly at first, to pull back. A few large institutional investors in Tokyo, watching the regulatory signal with the particular sensitivity of people who have borrowed billions against the assumption that credit will always be available, begin to exit. They are careful about it. They do not want to be seen selling. They trickle out through the 4th quarter of 1989 and the first weeks of 1990. The Nikkei barely moves. Land prices are still climbing. Everything looks fine, and then it is not fine. On January 4, 1990, the first trading day of the new decade, the Nikkei drops. Not dramatically, not in a way that causes panic headlines, but it drops on a day when it was expected to rise, and the people watching it closely feel a chill that has nothing to do with the January air. It drops again the next day, and the day after that. By February, the drop is undeniable. By April, the Nikkei is down 25% from its peak. By the end of 1990, it is down 40%. The real estate market takes longer to crack, because real estate does not have a ticker that updates every second to tell you what your property is worth today. But by 1991, the land price index begins to fall. By 1992, commercial property prices in Tokyo have dropped 30%. By 1993, residential prices are falling across all 6 major cities. The feedback loop that spent a decade running in one direction is now running in the other. Falling prices mean falling collateral values. Falling collateral values mean banks demanding repayment or additional security. Borrowers who cannot pay begin defaulting. Each default pushes more distressed property onto the market. More supply, falling prices, more defaults. The loop runs faster in reverse than it ran forward. Hiroshi Tanaka receives a letter from his bank in the autumn of 1991, his Kyoto commercial property. purchased for 30 million yen in 1988, is now valued at 18 million yen and falling. The bank requires him to either post additional collateral or begin repaying the principal immediately. His house, which was valued at 120 million yen at the peak, is now valued at 85 million yen, and his bank is not the only institution watching it nervously. Hiroshi, the careful man who packed his lunch and took the same train route every morning, now lies awake at 3 a.m. doing arithmetic that has no good answers. He still has his job. He is still the same careful person he has always been, but the trap he is in was built before the careful person could see it coming. Keiso Yamamoto, the Bank of Japan economist who wrote the memos nobody read, is not celebrating. She knew the prices were wrong. She did not know the correction would be this severe or this long. Nobody did. The academic literature on asset bubbles, which is extensive, will spend the next decade analyzing what happened in Japan and arriving at the conclusion that nobody fully understood the mechanism while they were inside it, which is not a satisfying conclusion but may be the only honest one. Yamaguchi-san, the Ginza real estate broker who knew it was fantasy and sold anyway, closes his brokerage in 1993. His commissions have evaporated. 3 of his clients are in bankruptcy proceedings. He does not feel guilty exactly. He feels like a man who stood in a river because everyone else was standing in a river and then got wet when it flooded. The courts across Japan flood with cases. Corporate bankruptcies in the early 1990s run at levels not seen since the immediate post-war years. The construction companies that built the towers that no one can now sell are filing for protection. The banks are sitting on mountains of non-performing loans they cannot acknowledge on their books without destroying their own capital ratios. The financial system has not collapsed, but it is not functioning. Japan will call the decade ahead the lost decade and then discover that the name is too optimistic because the second decade will also be lost, and then the third and the malaise that begins in 1990 will still be shaping Japanese monetary policy in 2024. The total wealth destroyed in the Japanese asset price collapse, measured from peak to trough across land and equities, is estimated at roughly 1,500 trillion yen. That is approximately 15 trillion US dollars. That is more than 3 times the annual economic output of Japan. And still, nobody asked the real question. So what really happened? History books describe the Japanese bubble as a story about cultural arrogance, about a nation that believed its own miracle so completely that it lost the ability to apply rational valuation to anything with a Japanese label on it. That explanation is not just incomplete, it is dangerously incomplete, because it implies the lesson is about Japanese psychology specifically rather than about a financial mechanism that operates identically in every culture that has ever encountered it. Here is what actually happened. The Plaza Accord of 1985 forced the Bank of Japan into an interest rate policy that was designed to solve a trade problem and instead created a credit explosion. When the official discount rate sits at 2.5% and inflation is running at 1 to 2%, the real cost of borrowing is essentially zero. When the real cost of borrowing is zero, and when the asset you are borrowing to buy has been rising by double digits for 30 years without a single annual decline, the rational decision for every individual actor in the system is to borrow as much as the bank will lend and buy as much land as the money can purchase. Each individual actor making this rational individual decision creates the collective outcome that is collectively irrational. This is the mechanism. It is not stupidity, it is the emergent result of individually sensible responses to a distorted price signal. The distortion is the interest rate, the price signal being distorted is the cost of credit, and the institution doing the distorting is the central bank. Acting under political pressure from an international agreement that was designed to address a problem in America, the banks amplify this effect through a mechanism worth understanding clearly. When a bank in Japan lends money against a piece of land, it holds that loan on its books as an asset. When land prices rise, the collateral backing that loan becomes more valuable, which under the accounting rules at the time means the bank can lend more money against the same piece of land. The bank's apparent financial strength increases automatically as land prices rise, because the assets on its balance sheet, the loans it has made, are secured by collateral that is rising in value. This makes the bank look healthier the more it lends into a rising asset market, which encourages it to lend more, which pushes the asset market higher, which makes the bank look healthier still. The loop has no internal brake. The only brake is an interest rate high enough to make borrowing painful, and the Bank of Japan has removed that brake entirely. The people who profited most from this system were not the ordinary salarymen who bought property with their savings. They were the banks that charged fees on every loan, the construction companies, that built the buildings, the real estate developers who created product for an insatiable market, and the corporate treasurers who ran the Zaytech operations that generated paper profits while the underlying manufacturing businesses quietly lost their competitive edge. The ordinary investors were the ones who held the bag when the music stopped. Here is the pattern, laid out in a form you will recognize when you see it again. First comes the new paradigm, the moment when everyone agrees that this time is genuinely different, that Japan has found a new model of economic organization that supersedes the old rules that land in a country with Japan's economic momentum simply cannot be judged by the same measures that apply to lesser economies. Second comes the easy money phase, where central bank policy makes credit cheap and abundant and borrowing feels not just possible but compulsory because the person who does not borrow to participate in the rising market is the person being left behind. Third comes the social proof cascade, where the success of early participants becomes visible to everyone around them and the psychological pressure to join becomes almost overwhelming, not because of greed exactly, but because standing outside the consensus feels like choosing poverty. Fourth comes the complexity that makes the system opaque and manipulable, the Zaytech instruments and the intercompany cross-holdings and the keiretsu structures that obscure exactly who owes what to whom, and make it impossible for any outsider and most insiders to calculate the true leverage in the system. Fifth comes peak euphoria, the window when the Nikkei is above 35.0 and the Imperial Palace grounds are worth more than California, and the Cassandras have been so thoroughly marginalized that the concept of caution itself seems like a relic of an earlier, less sophisticated era. Sixth comes the trigger, which in Japan's case is a regulatory memo from the Ministry of Finance that most people never read, and which touches off a cascade that nobody planned and nobody could stop once it started. And seventh comes the blame game, the decade of political paralysis and bank bailouts and zombie corporations kept alive by government support, rather than their own economic logic, while the actual causes of the disaster are debated in academic journals that the public does not read. Japan followed every step in order. Once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. Now let us talk about 2024 and 2025, because right now, the conditions that produced the Japanese bubble are not ancient history. They are the operating manual for the global financial system since 2008, after the financial crisis. Every major central bank in the world cut interest rates to near zero and kept them there for years. The Federal Reserve held rates near zero from 2008 to 2015 and then again from 2020 to 2022. The European Central Bank went negative. The Bank of Japan, still fighting the deflationary legacy of the 1990s collapse, has kept rates near zero for so long that an entire generation of Japanese investors has never experienced a normal interest rate environment. US total household debt crossed $17 trillion in 2023. Global debt across governments, corporations, and households sits above $300 trillion, roughly 330% of global GDP. These are numbers that have no historical precedent outside of wartime. Let us run through the checklist honestly. The new paradigm. It is present in multiple markets simultaneously. In technology stocks, the argument is that artificial intelligence represents a productivity transformation so fundamental that traditional price earnings valuations simply do not apply. In residential real estate across major cities from London to Sydney to New York to Toronto, the argument is that supply constraints are permanent and structural, that these cities will always have more buyers than sellers, that the rules which govern price discovery in normal markets do not apply to globally desired urban centers. In cryptocurrency, the argument is that digital scarcity creates a new asset class that cannot be evaluated using the frameworks developed for old asset classes. Every one of these arguments may have some truth in it. The Japanese argument about land scarcity in a mountainous island nation had truth in it too. What matters is not whether the argument is partially true. What matters is whether the price reflects even the most generous interpretation of the truth. Easy money. The era of near-zero rates has ended, but the debt structures it created have not. When rates were near zero, corporations borrowed trillions to buy back their own stock rather than invest in productive capacity. Governments borrowed at rates that assumed the cost of money would remain low indefinitely. Commercial real estate across the United States borrowed at floating rates that have now adjusted upward, producing a slow-motion crisis in office valuations that is working its way through bank balance sheets right now. The Bank of Japan finally raised rates in 2024 for the first time in decades, and the reaction in global markets, the yen carry trade, unwinding that sent shockwaves through equities in August 2024, demonstrated exactly how much of the global financial system had been built on the assumption that Japanese rates would stay near zero forever. Social proof. The retail investor participation in equity markets, particularly in the United States, reached historic highs during the pandemic period and has remained elevated. The number of Americans who own stocks directly or through retirement accounts is higher than at any point in history. When your neighbor's index fund is up 25% in a year and your own is up 22%, and every financial news channel you watch is telling you that missing out on equity exposure is the single greatest financial mistake you can make, the social pressure to stay invested, regardless of valuation, is enormous. The Cassandras, the analysts and economists who point at price-to-earnings ratios that rival 1929 and 2000 levels, are not silenced exactly. They are simply irrelevant to a market that has outperformed their caution for 15 consecutive years. Now, is this exactly like Japan in 1989? No, and saying so would be intellectually dishonest. The United States has the world's reserve currency and a central bank with genuine independence and a history of decisive action. The equity markets are more liquid and more diversified than the Tokyo Stock Exchange was in 1989. The regulatory frameworks are more sophisticated. The accounting transparency is greater. These are real differences, and they matter. What history teaches is not that every credit expansion leads to a Japanese-style decade of deflation. It teaches that every credit expansion ends, and the longer and larger the expansion, the more painful the normalization tends to be. Japan's experience is not a prediction, it is a proof of concept that asset prices can stay elevated for years past any rational justification, that the correction when it comes can be deeper and longer than anyone foresaw, and that the damage falls hardest on the people who participated last and borrowed most. What should you watch for? Watch central bank policy changes carefully, because Japan's lesson is that the bubble does not need to pop immediately when conditions change. It can hold for months after the trigger is introduced, while the participants convince themselves that this time the authorities will prevent the adjustment. Watch corporate debt levels and the proportion of that debt that is floating rate or approaching refinancing dates, because the moment when a company must roll over debt at a materially higher rate is the moment its business model faces a test it has not previously encountered. Watch for the quiet acknowledgement of bad debts in the banking system, because the history of Japan is the history of institutions choosing to pretend the losses do not exist rather than recognize them and restructure, a choice that feels like survival in the short term and produces a decade of stagnation as its consequence. And watch your own psychology, because the most dangerous moment in any bubble is not the moment you enter it. It is the moment when you know something is wrong, but the social pressure to stay in is stronger than the rational signal to get out. The pattern is there. The question is whether you will recognize it in time. So why do we keep falling for this? Not because we are stupid. The people who drove the Japanese bubble were not stupid. The bankers who built it were sophisticated professionals with decades of experience. The policymakers who enabled it were educated economists with access to the best data in the world. The salarymen who participated in it were cautious, careful, disciplined people who had spent their entire adult lives being financially responsible. They fell for it because the bubble exploits something more fundamental than intelligence. It exploits the human relationship with time. We feel the cost of missing out on gains that are happening right now, today, while our colleagues and neighbors are counting their profits. We do not feel the future cost of losses that have not happened yet. That will not happen for months or years. That may not happen before we have sold and taken our profits. The discount rate we apply to future pain is enormous. The discount rate we apply to present social pressure is essentially zero. This is not a cognitive failure. It is how human beings are built, and it has served us well in environments where the most important signal is what is happening immediately around us. It serves us catastrophically in financial markets, where the most important signal is almost always about something that has not happened yet. The Japanese bubble also teaches something harder to accept about the relationship between competence and catastrophe. The people who built and perpetuated the bubble were not reckless gamblers. They were, for the most part, doing exactly what their training, their incentives, and their institutions told them to do. The banker who approved the land loan was following a model that had worked for 30 years. The property developer who broke ground on a new tower was responding to genuine demand signals in the market. The policymaker who kept rates low was trying to protect Japanese exporters from the consequences of the Plaza Accord. Everyone was doing their job. The catastrophe was not the product of individuals failing their roles. It was the product of a system that had no mechanism for converting individual rationality into collective prudence. That is the insight that does not fit on a bumper sticker, and it is the one that matters most. You cannot control what the Bank of Japan decides to do with interest rates. You cannot control how American pension funds allocate capital. You cannot control whether the next generation of investors decides to treat AI stocks the way the previous generation treated .com stocks, or the generation before that treated Japanese equities. What you can control is your own framework for evaluation, not the framework that tells you whether prices will rise or fall in the next quarter, because nobody has that framework, and anyone who claims to is selling you something. The framework that tells you the difference between an asset priced on the basis of what it produces and an asset priced on the basis of what someone else will pay for it next year. The framework that tells you when the story being used to justify a valuation is doing work that the numbers alone cannot do. The framework that hears the phrase "this time is different" and responds not with cynicism but with the specific, disciplined question, different in what way, and is that difference large enough to justify this price? History gives you that framework if you are willing to read it without the reassuring assumption that you would have been smarter than the people who were there. The Imperial Palace grounds are not worth more than California. They never were. The market said they were for a few extraordinary years and then stopped saying it, and the correction was not gentle. That correction is still visible in Japanese interest rates and Japanese property prices and Japanese economic confidence 35 years later. Now I want to hear from you. Which market today do you think is closest to the 1989 Nikkei? And which country do you think has come closest to learning the real lesson from what happened in Japan? Drop your answer in the comments. The most honest analysis in these conversations always comes from the people living inside the markets they are describing. If this changed the way you see asset prices and the cost of cheap money, hit the like button. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Next time, we are looking at the .com bubble, the moment when a generation of brilliant engineers convinced Wall Street that revenue was a quaint concept from a pre-internet age. Another pattern hiding in plain sight, another lesson they do not teach in school. Remember, history does not repeat, but it rhymes, and right now it is rhyming in several markets at once. See you in the next one.